They thought she was just a bookkeeper. What they didn't know, she was documenting their downfall. Let me make sure the jury understands. You expect us to believe a bookkeeper discovered what forensic accountants with 20 years' experience somehow missed? The words hit like a slap. Deliberate. Practiced. The kind of contempt that had ended careers, broken witnesses, sent innocent people to prison for decades. The prosecutor circled closer. Gray suit, silver cufflinks. The confidence of a man who had never lost a case he wanted to win. He had just made the worst mistake of his 22-year career. The woman in the witness box didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her hands stayed folded. Her posture stayed straight. She wrote something in a small notebook, 3 words, maybe 4, then looked up with an expression that revealed nothing. What she wrote wasn't about the case on the docket. What she knew could destroy him. 18 months of investigation, 43 documented victims, 159 years of stolen freedom, and the man responsible was standing 6 feet away, performing for a jury that had no idea they were watching the final act of his career. I'm noting your question for my records. Her voice carried no emotion, no fear. Please continue. Something shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. A federal marshal in the back row stopped checking his phone. The defense attorney's pen paused mid-stroke. Even Judge Claiborne, who had presided over this circus without intervention for 20 minutes, leaned forward slightly. The prosecutor's smile didn't reach his eyes. He glanced toward the gallery's back row, where a woman in courthouse staff attire gave an almost imperceptible nod. A signal. But for what? The witness turned a page in her notebook. Whatever she had written, it wasn't about fraud allegations or financial discrepancies. It was about him, about the network he had built, about the 43 people whose lives he had destroyed through falsified transcripts, buried evidence, and coordinated lies. She had documented everything, and in 72 hours he would know exactly who she was. If you're satisfying with this satisfying stories, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This one gets wild. 3 weeks earlier, the apartment was quiet at 5:47 a.m. Nadine Pryce stood in front of her bathroom mirror, practicing an expression she had perfected over 18 years. Pleasant, unthreatening, forgettable. The face of a witness, not an investigator. The face of someone who balanced checkbooks for a living, not someone who had testified before federal grand juries, conducted undercover operations across 3 states, and built cases that had sent corrupt officials to prison. She checked her bag. Notebook. Backup pen. Phone battery at 100%. Backup battery in the side pocket. The habits of documentation, drilled into her at Quantico, reinforced through nearly 2 decades of fieldwork. She checked it again. Then a third time. The clothes laid out on her bed were deliberate but unremarkable. Gray slacks, white blouse, comfortable flats, nothing that suggested authority, nothing that demanded attention. A woman who could blend into any corporate office, any government building, any courthouse in America. Her credentials were locked in a safe deposit box across town. Her service weapon was secured at the field office. For the next 3 weeks, she was Nadine Pryce, forensic accountant, employee of Mitchell & Associates, witness for the defense in a routine fraud case. Nothing more. The coffee maker beeped. She poured a cup, added precisely 1 sugar, the same ritual for 15 years, and stood by the window watching Atlanta wake up. Somewhere in this city, people were going about their lives without knowing that the prosecutor who had convicted their neighbors, their brothers, their sons, had been systematically falsifying evidence for years, without knowing that the transcripts from their trials had been altered, without knowing that the system they trusted had been weaponized against them. 43 cases. 89% of affected defendants were Black or Hispanic. Average sentence enhancement following transcript alterations, 3.7 years. 159 years of stolen freedom. She finished her coffee, washed the cup, placed it in the drying rack with the handle facing left. Another habit, another detail that only mattered in a life built on precision. Today, she would walk into Fulton County Courthouse as a civilian witness. She would endure whatever games the prosecution played. She would document every violation, every threat, every coordinated act of intimidation. And when the time came, she would burn it all down. The security line at Fulton County Courthouse moved slowly at 8:23 a.m. Nadine waited in the general public queue, watching attorneys and staff members breeze through the separate entrance to her left. She could have flashed credentials and bypassed the line entirely, could have walked through with the authority that 18 years of federal service had earned. But the bookkeeper from Mitchell & Associates didn't have credentials. The bookkeeper waited in line like everyone else. That line moves faster when people have their IDs ready. The voice came from behind her, sharp, performative, loud enough to carry. A woman in her 50s, courthouse staff lanyard visible, expensive shoes, the posture of someone who had spent decades accumulating small powers and wielding them against people who couldn't fight back. Victoria Langford, Chief Clerk Supervisor. The woman who controlled information flow through the DA's office. The woman who decided which cases got expedited and which got lost in bureaucratic limbo. The woman whose name appeared in 14 of the 43 case files Nadine had been building for 18 months. Some of us have actual work to do. Nadine didn't react, didn't turn around. She removed her belt, placed her bag on the conveyor, and stepped through the metal detector. The guard waved his wand slowly, once, twice. His eyes flicked to something, or someone, behind her. "Step aside, ma'am. Random additional screening." It wasn't random, third time this week. But she complied without comment, arms extended, while the guard patted down her shoulders, her sides, her legs. His touch lingered longer than necessary. His expression suggested he was enjoying this. Badge number 4471. She filed it away for later. "You're clear." She collected her belongings. Victoria Langford brushed past without a glance, heels clicking on marble as she disappeared toward the administrative offices. The security guard was already waving through the next person, a white woman in a business suit who hadn't been asked to step aside. Nadine walked toward courtroom 4B. The pattern was clear. The message was deliberate. She was being watched, tracked, tested. Good. Let them watch. The hallway outside courtroom 4B smelled like old wood and floor wax. Nadine sat on a wooden bench in the witness waiting area, back straight, hands folded over her notebook. Around her, the courthouse ecosystem moved in its familiar rhythms. Clerks pushing file carts, attorneys huddled in urgent conversations, defendants waiting with the hollow-eyed patience of people whose futures had been placed in strangers' hands. Bookkeepers on the stand Thursday. The voice drifted from somewhere to her left. Male, confident. The tone of someone accustomed to being overheard and not caring. Shouldn't be a problem. Holloway eats witnesses like her for breakfast. Gerald Kessler, defense attorney turned fixer. The man who handled delicate matters for the DA's office. The man whose fingerprints appeared on case after case where evidence had disappeared, witnesses had recanted, charges had been mysteriously dropped. He walked past without lowering his voice, without acknowledging her presence. Or perhaps he had acknowledged it in his own way, making sure she heard, making sure she understood what was coming. Nadine opened her notebook, wrote the date, the time, and the quote, word for word. Documentation. The witness prep room was small and smelled like burnt coffee. Marcus Cole, defense attorney, sat across from her with the distracted energy of someone running 3 trials simultaneously. His phone buzzed every 45 seconds. His eyes kept drifting to the stack of files on the table beside him, other cases, other clients, other problems that demanded attention. Just answer what's asked. He checked his phone. Don't volunteer information. Holloway will try to rattle you. That's his thing. Don't take the bait. I understand. The documents speak for themselves. You found the discrepancies in the defendant's financial records. That's all you need to say. He was already standing. Questions? No. Good. I'll see you in there." He was gone in under 4 minutes. Nadine checked her watch. 3 minutes and 47 seconds, including the time it took him to gather his files and reach the door. She opened her notebook, wrote, "Prep session, 3 min 47 seconds. Attorney distracted, inadequate." The defendant in this case, a small business owner accused of embezzlement, was relying on Marcus Cole to save him from prison. The evidence Nadine had found genuinely did exonerate him. But Marcus Cole was handling 6 other cases this month. Marcus Cole couldn't remember his client's middle name. This was how the system worked. Overworked defense attorneys against a prosecution machine that had unlimited resources, institutional backing, and a win-at-all-costs prosecutor who had never met a conviction he couldn't manufacture. Nadine closed her notebook. She would do what she could for the defendant in this case. She would testify truthfully about what she had found. But her real work was larger than one case. Her real work was burning the machine to the ground. The courthouse cafeteria hummed with the lunch hour crowd at 12:17 p.m. Nadine sat alone at a table near the windows, picking at a salad she had no appetite for. Her position gave her a clear sightline to the corner table where Garrett Holloway held court with his inner circle. Detective Reese Thornton sat to Holloway's right, 6'3", 240 pounds, the kind of man who had spent 20 years learning that his badge made him untouchable. His laugh was too loud, his gestures too broad, the performance of someone who needed everyone in the room to know he was important. Victoria Langford sat across from them, nursing a cup of coffee and nodding at whatever Holloway was saying. Gerald Kessler leaned against the wall nearby, phone pressed to his ear, but his eyes kept drifting to the conversation. The body language of people who owned the space, who had carved out this corner of the justice system and claimed it as their personal kingdom. "You see the witness list for Thursday?" Thornton's voice carried, deliberately, Nadine suspected. He wanted people to hear. "Some affirmative action hire from the accounting firm. Should be fun." Laughter. Backslaps. The easy camaraderie of men who had never faced consequences for anything they had done. Nadine's fork paused for half a second, then continued. She photographed her lunch receipt, timestamp visible, location metadata embedded, and placed it in her wallet. The receipt itself was meaningless, but the timestamp would corroborate her presence, her observations, the conversation she had documented in her notebook. Everything was evidence. Everything could be used. The afternoon session began at 1:32 p.m. Nadine took her seat in the gallery, watching as the fraud case proceeded through its tedious rhythms. Opening statements. Prosecution's first witnesses. The droning recitation of financial records that made half the jury's eyes glaze over. Holloway was smooth, practiced. He guided his witnesses through their testimony with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Every question was designed. Every answer was anticipated. The jury saw a dedicated public servant pursuing justice. Nadine saw something else. She saw the way his eyes flickered toward the defense table whenever Marcus Cole looked down at his notes. She saw the almost imperceptible nod he exchanged with Victoria Langford when a piece of evidence was admitted. She saw the machinery of corruption operating in plain sight, visible only to someone who knew what to look for. At 3:47 p.m., the judge called a recess. Nadine remained seated while the courtroom emptied, pretending to review her notes. "Ms. Pryce?" She looked up. A court officer stood at the end of her row, young, nervous, clipboard in hand. "Your testimony has been moved. You're on tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." "I was told Thursday." "Schedule changed." He shrugged. "Prosecution's request." Nadine nodded, closed her notebook. The schedule change wasn't random. Nothing in this courthouse was random. They were testing her, pushing to see if she would crack under pressure, if she would make a mistake that could be exploited. She gathered her things and walked toward the exit. Tomorrow morning, less than 18 hours to prepare for whatever Holloway had planned. She had been preparing for 18 months. She was ready. Make sure you're subscribed because things are about to escalate fast, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The parking garage at 5:22 p.m. was half empty and poorly lit. Nadine walked toward her car, keys in hand, footsteps echoing off concrete. The garage's security cameras had blind spots. She had mapped them weeks ago. 3 cameras covered the main entrance and exit. 2 more covered the elevator banks. The rest of the structure had gaps, dark corners where anything could happen without being recorded. She was 30 feet from her car when she heard the second set of footsteps. They had been matching her pace, staying just far enough behind to seem coincidental. But the rhythm was wrong, too deliberate, too controlled. She kept walking, adjusted her grip on her keys, positioned them between her fingers, not as a weapon, but as a justification for whatever came next. Late night for a bookkeeper. The voice came from her left. A man stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. Detective Reese Thornton, still in his suit from the courtroom, badge visible on his belt. Nadine stopped, turned to face him. Her back was to her car, the exit ramp visible over his shoulder. "I'm leaving now. Saw your little show in there today." He moved closer, not rushing, the casual approach of someone who had all the time in the world. "Sitting in the gallery, taking notes. Some people might find that suspicious." "I'm a witness. Witnesses are allowed in the gallery." "Witnesses do what they're told." He was close now, too close. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, but near enough to make the implication clear. "Some people don't understand how things work around here." "I understand perfectly." "Do you?" He tilted his head, studied her like she was something to be evaluated, measured, disposed of. "Because I've seen witnesses who thought they were smarter than everyone else, thought they could cause trouble, make people look bad." "What happened to them?" The question landed differently than he expected. Most people would have been trembling by now, would have been apologizing, promising cooperation, begging to be left alone. Nadine's voice was steady. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't leave his face. Thornton's smile thinned. "Bad things, Ms. Pryce. Bad things happen to difficult people." "Is that a threat, Detective?" "It's advice." He reached out, slowly, deliberately, and brushed a piece of lint from her shoulder. The touch lingered, a violation disguised as helpfulness. Friendly advice from someone who's been around long enough to know how the system works. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't give him the reaction he wanted. "This conversation is being recorded." She held up her phone, red light visible on the screen. Thornton's hand froze. His expression cycled through surprise, anger, calculation, then settled into something cold. "You record a cop without consent? That's a crime." "Georgia's a one-party consent state. I'm the party." She lowered the phone but didn't stop the recording. "Anything else, Detective?" The moment stretched. She could see him running through options. Grab the phone, escalate the confrontation, find a way to spin this in his favor. But the recording had changed the equation. Whatever he did next would be documented. "See you around, Ms. Pryce." He stepped back, turned, walked toward the elevator bank without looking back. His footsteps echoed off concrete until the door closed behind him. Nadine waited 60 seconds, then 90. She checked the shadows, the blind spots, the corners where someone else might be waiting. Only when she was certain she was alone did she unlock her car and climb inside. Her hands were steady as she started the engine. The recording was already uploading to a secure server. It would join 42 other files: body cam footage, intercepted communications, witness statements, digital forensics reports. 18 months of evidence, carefully compiled, waiting for the right moment. Thornton had just added another nail to his own coffin. She pulled out of the garage and merged into evening traffic. Tomorrow morning, she would take the stand. She would testify about financial discrepancies in a fraud case. She would endure whatever Holloway threw at her, and she would document every single moment. The apartment was dark when she returned at 6:41 p.m. Nadine didn't turn on the lights immediately. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust, scanning the space for anything out of place. The habits of a career spent in hostile environments. Always assume someone has been here, always verify before you relax. Nothing moved. The air was still. The small tells she had left, a hair across the doorframe, a specific angle on the blinds, a paper clip positioned precisely on the kitchen counter, were all undisturbed. She locked the door behind her, checked the windows. Only then did she turn on the lamp by the couch. Her laptop sat on the desk where she had left it, encrypted, protected, connected to a VPN that routed through 3 different countries before reaching FBI servers. She opened it and began uploading the parking garage recording. The file joined the others in a folder labeled Case 424CR00847WRC. 43 subfolders, hundreds of documents, thousands of pages of evidence. She opened a secure messaging application and typed 3 words: contact made, escalating. The response came in under a minute. Continue as planned. Support available if needed. She closed the laptop, sat in the darkness for a long moment, listening to the city outside her window. Somewhere out there, people were going about their lives, eating dinner, watching television, putting children to bed. People who had no idea that the justice system they trusted had been corrupted from the inside. People whose neighbors and friends and family members had been sent to prison based on falsified evidence. 159 years. The number haunted her. Had haunted her since she first calculated it, cross-referencing case files and sentencing records and transcript alterations. 159 years of human life, stolen by a prosecutor who saw conviction rates as his personal scorecard. Tomorrow, she would sit in a witness box and let him attack her, let him try to break her down, let him demonstrate exactly who he was for the benefit of her recording devices and her documentation and the case she had been building for 18 months. And when the time came, when all the pieces were in place and the evidence was overwhelming and there was nowhere left for him to hide, she would watch him fall. She went to bed at 10:15 p.m. She did not dream. Date. Morning came at 5:32 a.m. Nadine went through her routine with mechanical precision. Shower, coffee, clothes laid out the night before, the same gray and white combination that said professional without saying authority. Hair pulled back, minimal makeup, the appearance of a woman who had nothing to hide. She checked her bag. Notebook, 2 pens, phone with recording application preloaded, backup battery, the small details that separated amateurs from professionals. At 7:48 a.m., she walked through the courthouse security checkpoint. The same guard who had given her trouble yesterday was on duty. He started to wave her toward the secondary screening area, then stopped, hesitated. Something had changed in his expression. "Go ahead, ma'am." She walked through without comment, filed the change away for later analysis. Someone had spoken to him. Someone had decided that the harassment needed to stop, or at least pause, but who and why? The witness waiting area outside courtroom 4B was empty at 8:23 a.m. She sat on the same bench as yesterday, opened her notebook, and began reviewing her notes for testimony. The financial analysis was straightforward. The defendant, Robert Kwame, small business owner, had been accused of embezzling $412,000 from his own company over 18 months. The evidence supposedly showed 17 payments to vendors with no corresponding invoices. What Nadine had found was different. The payments were legitimate, supplies for Kwame's restaurant supply business. The invoices existed but had been misfiled by a bookkeeper who quit 6 months before the investigation began. The embezzlement was nothing more than sloppy record-keeping that had been misinterpreted, deliberately or otherwise, by investigators who wanted a high-profile conviction. Robert Kwame was innocent, and if Holloway had his way, an innocent man would spend years in prison while the prosecutor added another win to his record. Not today. The courtroom filled at 8:51 a.m. Nadine watched from the gallery as attorneys took their positions, jurors filed into their box, and spectators settled into the wooden benches. The ritual of American justice, orderly, dignified, completely disconnected from the reality of what was about to happen. Garrett Holloway entered at 8:57 a.m. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never lost a fight he cared about winning. His suit was expensive. His smile was practiced. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Nadine before moving on. He knew who she was, knew she would be testifying today, and he was already planning how to destroy her. All rise. Judge Warren Claiborne took the bench at 9 a.m. exactly, 62 years old, 23 years on the bench, a reputation for efficiency that some called fairness and others called indifference. Please be seated. The court calls the matter of the State of Georgia versus Robert Quam. Mr. Cole, you may call your witness. Marcus Cole stood, straightened his tie, shot a nervous glance at Holloway that suggested he knew what was coming. The defense calls Nadine Pryce. She walked to the witness stand with measured steps, placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, sat down and folded her hands in her lap. Marcus Cole approached the witness box with a stack of documents. His questions were methodical, establishing her background, her credentials, her role in analyzing the defendant's financial records. Ms. Pryce, what did your analysis reveal about the 17 disputed payments? The payments were legitimate business expenses. The invoices existed but had been misfiled in the company's storage system. When I cross-referenced the payment dates with delivery records, every transaction matched a documented shipment of supplies. So there was no embezzlement. In my professional opinion, no. The defendant was the victim of poor record-keeping, not the perpetrator of fraud. She presented her findings clearly and methodically. Dates, amounts, corresponding documentation, the kind of testimony that should have been devastating to the prosecution's case. Holloway sat at the prosecution table, making notes. His expression revealed nothing, but his pen moved across the page with an intensity that suggested he was preparing something. At 9:32 a.m., Marcus Cole concluded his direct examination. Your witness, Mr. Holloway. Garrett Holloway rose from his chair with the deliberate slowness of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. Ms. Pryce. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his tie. Small rituals designed to make her wait, to remind everyone in the room who held the power. Thank you for being here today. You're welcome. Let's start with your background. He picked up a folder from his table, thick, official-looking, the kind of prop that suggested damning revelations inside. You've been working as a forensic accountant for approximately 8 months. Is that correct? At my current firm, yes. 8 months. He let the number hang in the air. And before that? I held various positions. Various positions. He turned to the jury with an expression of theatrical confusion. How delightfully vague. Let me be more specific. What is your educational background? Bachelor's degree in accounting. Additional training in forensic documentation and evidence procedures. The words evidence procedures landed differently than she expected. Holloway's rhythm stuttered, just for a moment, before he recovered. His eyes narrowed. Something about her answer had surprised him. Good. Ms. Pryce, you claim to have found invoices that the police investigation missed. Is that your testimony? The invoices were misfiled. I found them in a storage location that wasn't included in the initial search warrant. So you went looking in places the police didn't search? I conducted a thorough review of available records. That's my job. Your job? He moved closer. Too close. The distance between them violated courtroom norms. Georgia Uniform Superior Court Rule 9.2 established that witnesses were entitled to reasonable space during examination. Judge Claiborne should have intervened. He didn't. Let me tell you what I think happened, Ms. Pryce. Holloway's voice dropped, more intimate, more threatening. I think you manufactured these so-called invoices to justify your firm's billing. I think you're a fraud testifying about fraud. Marcus Cole rose. Yes. Objection. Argumentative. Counsel is testifying. Sustained. Judge Claiborne's voice was flat, disinterested. Mr. Holloway, rephrase. But the damage was done. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The jury had heard it. They would remember it. Holloway smiled. Withdrawn. Let me ask instead, have you ever been disciplined by any employer? No. Terminated? No. Investigated for misconduct? No. The questions came faster. Each one a jab. Each one designed to rattle her, to break her rhythm, to make her stumble. She answered each one the same way. Calm, measured, precise. She had faced interrogation techniques in training that made Holloway look like an amateur. The cross-examination continued for 47 minutes. Holloway tried every approach in his arsenal. He questioned her credentials. He insinuated bias. He suggested, without evidence, that she had been paid to manufacture exculpatory documents. He raised his voice. He lowered it. He invaded her space. He retreated to his table. Nothing worked. Ms. Pryce. His frustration was beginning to show, a tightness around his eyes, a sharpness in his voice that suggested he wasn't accustomed to witnesses who refused to break. You seem remarkably well prepared for a simple bookkeeper. Forensic accountant. Excuse me? My title is forensic accountant, not bookkeeper. She met his eyes, held them. The distinction matters. The courtroom stirred. Witnesses didn't correct Garrett Holloway. Witnesses apologized to Garrett Holloway. They cried. They stammered. They begged for mercy. They didn't lecture him on professional terminology. The distinction matters. He repeated her words with exaggerated precision. Tell me, Ms. Pryce, what other distinctions matter to you? Accuracy, documentation, the difference between actual evidence and assumptions presented as fact. Objection. Marcus Cole was on his feet. Counsel is badgering the witness. Sustained. Judge Claiborne glanced at the clock. Mr. Holloway, do you have substantive questions, or are we done here? Holloway's jaw tightened. He was losing, not the case necessarily, but the moment. The jury was watching a prosecutor bully a witness who refused to be bullied. The optics were terrible. One more question, Your Honor. He turned back to Nadine. Miss Pryce, are you working with anyone else? Are you part of some coordinated effort to undermine this prosecution? The question was a fishing expedition, a desperate attempt to find something, anything that could be used against her. She considered her answer carefully. The truth was, yes, she was part of an 18-month federal investigation that would eventually destroy his career. But admitting that now would compromise everything. I'm a forensic accountant. I analyze financial records. That's the extent of my involvement in this case. Holloway held her gaze for a long moment. Something flickered behind his eyes. Suspicion, maybe. Recognition that this witness was different. That something about her didn't fit the profile of a simple civilian expert. No further questions. He returned to his seat. The courtroom exhaled. But Nadine knew this wasn't over. She had wounded his pride, had made him look foolish in front of a jury. Men like Garrett Holloway didn't forget that kind of humiliation. They punished it. The lunch recess was called at 12:14 p.m. Nadine didn't go to the cafeteria. She gathered her things and walked toward the stairwell at the end of the hall, a route she had mapped during her first week in the courthouse. No cameras, no foot traffic. A place where she could make a call without being observed. She pulled out her second phone, a burner that had never passed through courthouse security. The device was registered to a shell company that existed only on paper. Its signal was encrypted. Its location data was spoofed. She dialed a number from memory. Status? Subject is escalating. She kept her voice low. He's suspicious, more aggressive than anticipated. Can you maintain cover? Yes, but the timeline may need to accelerate. Silence on the line. Then, how much time do we have? Days, maybe less. He's going to dig into my background. If he finds anything, He won't find anything. Your cover is solid. I know, but he's not stupid. He knows something is wrong. He just doesn't know what. More silence. The handler was calculating, weighing risks, considering options, mapping out scenarios. Continue as planned. We'll have assets in place if extraction becomes necessary. Understood. She ended the call, deleted the record from the phone's memory, stood in the stairwell for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of the courthouse, voices echoing, doors closing, the grinding machinery of a justice system that had been corrupted from the inside. 18 months of work, 43 documented cases, 159 years of stolen freedom, and a prosecutor who was beginning to realize that the woman he had tried to destroy was something far more dangerous than a bookkeeper. The afternoon brought new complications. Nadine was leaving the restroom at 1:47 p.m. when Victoria Langford materialized from around the corner. The chief clerk supervisor moved with the practiced casualness of someone who wanted to appear spontaneous, but the timing was too perfect, the positioning too deliberate. Miss Pryce. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Impressive performance this morning. Thank you. Most witnesses don't hold up so well against Mr. Holloway. He has a reputation. I've heard. Have you? Victoria tilted her head, studied her with an appraiser's eye. Word of advice from someone who's been around this courthouse for a long time. Mr. Holloway doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. Is that a warning? Call it professional courtesy. Victoria moved closer, lowered her voice. Smart witnesses find ways to clarify their testimony after a difficult cross-examination. Memory is funny that way. Sometimes we remember things wrong. Sometimes documents get reinterpreted. Nadine held her ground. Are you suggesting I change my testimony? I'm suggesting that life is easier for people who cooperate, and harder, much harder, for people who don't. The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Victoria Langford was offering her a choice: fall in line or face consequences. I appreciate the advice, Ms. Langford. Nadine's voice stayed level. I'll keep it in mind. She started to walk away. Victoria's hand shot out and grabbed her arm, hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to make the point clear. You don't understand how this works. Victoria's mask had slipped. Behind the professional polish was something raw, something desperate. People who make trouble in this courthouse have accidents. They lose jobs. They face charges for things they didn't do. Their lives become very, very complicated. Nadine looked down at the hand on her arm, looked up at Victoria's face, said nothing. The moment stretched. Victoria released her grip, stepped back. The mask slid back into place, polished, professional, deadly. Think about what I said, Miss Pryce. Think very carefully. She walked away. Her heels clicked on marble until she disappeared around a corner. Nadine stood alone in the hallway, rubbing her arm where Victoria's fingers had pressed into flesh. The woman had made a mistake. Physical contact, witnesses potentially nearby, an explicit threat that had been delivered in a semi-public space. Evidence. Always more evidence. The afternoon session began at 2:15 p.m. Nadine sat in the gallery, watching as the fraud case continued its tedious progression. The prosecution called a forensic accountant of their own, a man in his 60s who looked uncomfortable in his suit and kept glancing at Holloway for reassurance. His testimony contradicted everything Nadine had said that morning. The invoices she had found were questionable. The methodology she had used was unorthodox. His opinion, delivered with the practiced certainty of someone who had been well paid for his conclusions, was that the defendant had indeed embezzled $412,000. The jury looked confused. Two expert witnesses, two completely different conclusions. How were they supposed to know who was telling the truth? That was the point, of course. Holloway didn't need to prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt. He just needed to muddy the waters enough that the jury would default to trusting the prosecutor. The system was rigged. The defendant was probably guilty. Why would the government charge an innocent man? Nadine wrote in her notebook. Date, time, testimony summary. The prosecution's expert would be included in her final report, another piece of evidence showing how Holloway's office operated. At 4:38 p.m., the judge called an end to the day's proceedings. Court would resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. for closing arguments. The defendant, Robert Kwame, sat at the defense table with his head in his hands. His wife and teenage daughter were in the gallery behind him, watching with the hollow-eyed desperation of people who could see their family being destroyed and couldn't do anything to stop it. Nadine gathered her things. There was nothing more she could do for them today. The case would go to the jury tomorrow. And despite her testimony, despite the clear evidence that Robert Kwame was innocent, there was a good chance he would be convicted anyway. That was how the system worked. That was why she was here. Mayday. Don't go anywhere. The next part changes everything about this case. The parking garage at 5:52 p.m. was busier than the day before. Nadine walked toward her car, keys ready, awareness heightened. The encounter with Thornton had taught her to expect confrontation. The encounter with Victoria had confirmed that the network was beginning to move against her. She was 40 feet from her car when she saw him. A man stood between her vehicle and the elevator bank. Not Thornton, someone younger. Plain clothes. No badge visible. The posture of someone who had been waiting. She kept walking. Altered her path slightly, angling toward the exit ramp rather than her car. Ms. Pryce. The man's voice echoed off concrete. We need to talk. She didn't stop, didn't turn, kept moving toward the exit. Ms. Pryce. Footsteps behind her now, faster, closing the distance. I said we need to talk. She broke into a jog. The exit ramp was 50 feet away. 40. 30. A hand grabbed her shoulder, hard, and spun her around. The man was in his 30s, athletic build, eyes that showed nothing. He held her shoulder with one hand and reached inside his jacket with the other. Relax. His voice was calm, almost bored. I just want to have a conversation. Let go of me. When I'm ready. She assessed the situation in a fraction of a second. He was bigger, stronger, had at least one hand occupied. His center of gravity was high. His stance suggested training, but not mastery. She twisted her shoulder sharply, not away from his grip, but into it, and drove her palm into his solar plexus. The blow wasn't hard enough to cause serious damage, but it was enough to break his grip, to make him stagger, to give her the half-second she needed. She ran. The exit ramp was 20 feet away. 10, 5. Stop! She burst onto the street level, into evening traffic, into crowds of people walking home from work. The man had stopped at the top of the ramp, unwilling to pursue her into a public space with witnesses. She didn't stop running until she was 3 blocks away. The safe house was a studio apartment in a nondescript building on the east side of Atlanta. Nadine had rented it 6 months ago, using a shell identity, one of 3 safe locations she maintained for situations exactly like this. The apartment had no connection to her real name, her FBI credentials, or her cover identity as a forensic accountant. She locked the door behind her, checked the windows, pulled the blinds. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. She had been trained for confrontations like the one in the parking garage, had practiced the techniques hundreds of times in controlled environments. But training was different from reality. She pulled out her secure phone and dialed her handler. We have a problem. Report. Physical confrontation, parking garage, unknown male, aggressive. I got away, but they're escalating faster than anticipated. Are you compromised? Unknown. I don't think he was law enforcement. No badge, no credentials. Could be private security. Could be something else. Silence on the line. The handler was processing, running the information through mental databases, considering implications. Can you continue the operation? Yes, but I need to know who sent him. We'll work on it. In the meantime, vary your routes. Don't return to your primary residence tonight. We'll have surveillance in place by morning. Understood. She ended the call, sat on the narrow bed in the empty apartment and stared at the ceiling. The network was moving against her. Victoria's threats, Thornton's intimidation, and now a physical confrontation with someone whose identity she didn't know. They were testing her, probing for weaknesses, trying to determine what she was and how she could be neutralized, which meant they were scared, which meant she was getting close. Morning came at 5:18 a.m. Nadine had slept poorly, 2 hours, maybe 3, on the safe house's thin mattress. She showered in cold water. Dressed in clothes she kept stored in the apartment for emergencies, left through the back entrance, and took a circuitous route to the courthouse. The security checkpoint was busy at 8:41 a.m. She waited in line, submitted to screening, collected her belongings. The guard who had given her trouble before was absent, replaced by a younger woman who processed her without incident. The courtroom was already filling when she arrived at 8:53 a.m. Today was closing arguments. Today, the jury would hear final statements from both sides. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, they would deliver a verdict. She found a seat in the gallery and opened her notebook. Robert Kwame sat at the defense table with his attorney. His wife and daughter were in the front row behind him. The family's faces showed the strain of the past 3 days, the sleepless nights, the fear, the helplessness of watching their future be decided by strangers. Garrett Holloway entered at 8:58 a.m. He was carrying a thick folder, the same prop he had used during his cross-examination. His expression was tight, controlled, the look of a man who had something to prove. All rise. Judge Claiborne took the bench. The ritual began. Holloway's closing argument was masterful. He painted Robert Kwame as a predator, a man who had betrayed the trust of his investors, his employees, his community. He referenced the prosecution's expert witness without mentioning Nadine's contradictory testimony. He spoke of justice, accountability, the need to send a message to others who might be tempted to steal. The jury listened. Some nodded. One woman in the front row was already looking at Kwame with disgust. Marcus Cole's closing was competent but uninspired. He mentioned Nadine's testimony, the found invoices, the legitimate payments, the absence of actual embezzlement. But his voice lacked conviction. His words lacked fire. He was going through the motions, fighting a battle he didn't believe he could win. At 11:32 a.m., the judge gave final instructions to the jury. They retired to deliberate. Nadine stayed in the gallery, watching as the courtroom emptied. Robert Kwame was led back to a holding cell to wait for the verdict. His wife collapsed into tears. His daughter, 16, maybe 17, sat frozen, staring at nothing. This was what Holloway's system produced. Innocent people destroyed, families shattered, lives ruined by a prosecutor who cared more about his conviction rate than the truth. 43 documented cases, 159 years of stolen freedom. And this was just one county in one state. How many other Holloways were operating across the country? How many other networks were corrupting justice systems from the inside? The scope of it was overwhelming. The injustice was bottomless. But she was here, and she would do what she could. The jury returned at 4:23 p.m. 6 hours of deliberation. Long enough to suggest serious discussion. Not long enough to suggest deadlock. Nadine was in the gallery when the verdict was read. In the matter of the state of Georgia versus Robert Kwame, on the charge of embezzlement in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant. The foreman paused, looked at the judge, looked at the defendant. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Robert Kwame's wife screamed and embraced her daughter. Marcus Cole slumped in his chair with an expression of stunned relief. Even Judge Claiborne looked surprised. And Garrett Holloway? Garrett Holloway sat motionless at the prosecution table, staring at the jury with an expression that promised consequences. His eyes moved across the room, stopped on Nadine, held. In that moment, she knew. He understood now that she was more than a forensic accountant. He didn't know what she was or who she was working for, but he knew she was dangerous, and he would find out, no matter what it took. Joe. The celebration in the courthouse hallway lasted 12 minutes. Robert Kwame embraced his wife. His daughter clung to his arm. Supporters who had gathered for the verdict shouted congratulations and took photographs for social media. Nadine stood apart, watching from a distance. Her work on this case was done. The innocent man would go home to his family. The system had worked, this time in this case, because she had been there to document the truth. But Holloway was already moving. She watched him exit the courtroom with Gerald Kessler at his side. They walked quickly, heads together, voices low. Kessler glanced toward her, brief, calculating, then looked away. They were planning something, regrouping, figuring out how to identify her, neutralize her, eliminate whatever threat she represented. She had bought herself time, nothing more. The real confrontation was still coming. The evening brought a new development. Nadine was at the safe house, reviewing files on her encrypted laptop, when a message arrived on her secure phone. The sender was blocked. The message contained 3 sentences and an attachment. You're asking the right questions. Look at the attached files. A friend. The attachment was encrypted, but with a key that only someone with federal credentials would know. She opened it. Inside were 3 case files: 2019 CV08834, 2021 CV01156, 2022 CV09923. 3 minority defendants, all prosecuted by Holloway, all convicted based on testimony that had been altered after the fact, all serving sentences that had been enhanced based on fabricated evidence. The pattern. Someone inside the network was helping her. Someone who wanted Holloway exposed as much as she did. But who? And why now? She studied the files until 2 a.m., cross-referenced them with her existing documentation, added them to the evidence package she had been building for 18 months. The picture was becoming clearer. The network was larger than she had realized, more organized, more protected, and someone inside wanted it destroyed. Day 3 began at 5:41 a.m. Nadine returned to her primary apartment, cautiously, checking for surveillance, varying her route. The apartment was undisturbed. The small tells she had left were all in place. She showered, changed clothes, checked her bag 3 times. At 8:12 a.m., she received a subpoena. The document was hand-delivered by a process server who knocked on her door at exactly the moment she was about to leave for work. He was young, professional, nervous in the way of someone who knew he was delivering bad news. Nadine Pryce? Yes. You've been served. She took the envelope. The process server disappeared down the hallway without another word. The subpoena was from the district attorney's office. It demanded that she appear at a hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. the next day. It demanded that she produce all financial records, communications, and work product related to the Kwame case. The subpoena was overly broad, arguably unconstitutional, but fighting it would mean legal fees, delays, exposure. This was Holloway's response to the acquittal. He couldn't punish Robert Kwame, so he would punish the witness who had helped free him. She photographed the subpoena, uploaded it to her secure server, added it to the evidence file. Then she called her handler. We have a new development. Report. Subpoena from the DA's office. Fishing expedition. They're trying to find out who I am. Can you quash it? Probably, but it will draw attention, make them more suspicious. Silence on the line. The handler was calculating options. Comply with the narrowest possible interpretation. Produce documents directly related to the Kwame case. Nothing else. Understood. And if they push for more? Then we accelerate the timeline. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning. Nadine spent the intervening hours preparing. She compiled documents. She reviewed Georgia procedure. She practiced arguments that would satisfy the subpoena's requirements without exposing her real identity or compromising the federal investigation. She was ready. What she wasn't ready for was Gerald Kessler. The hearing was held in Judge Claiborne's chambers. Informal, private, no jury to witness whatever happened. Holloway was present but silent, letting his fixer do the work. Kessler was impressive. He cited case law. He referenced precedent. He argued that Nadine's refusal to produce all requested documents was obstruction of justice, contempt of court, potentially evidence of criminal conspiracy. She responded with her own citations, her own precedents, her own arguments about the constitutional limits of subpoena power. Judge Claiborne watched the back and forth with growing impatience. "Ms. Pryce," his voice cut through Kessler's latest objection, "you're not an attorney." "I'm entitled to represent myself in matters concerning my own compliance, Your Honor." "That may be technically true, but this hearing is testing my patience. Can you produce the documents directly related to your financial analysis, or can't you?" "I can and will produce those documents. What I cannot produce are personal records, communications, and work product that fall outside the scope of the original case." "Why not?" "Because the subpoena's demand for those materials violates the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizure. The government cannot demand access to a citizen's private records without specific, articulable cause." Kessler jumped in. "Your Honor, the witness is hiding something. Her evasion proves—" "Mr. Kessler." Claiborne's voice hardened. "I'll decide what proves what in my chambers." The judge studied Nadine for a long moment. Something in his expression suggested he was recalculating, seeing her differently than he had during the trial. "Motion to compel is granted in part and denied in part. Ms. Pryce will produce documents directly related to her financial analysis of the Kwame case. Personal records and communications are excluded. That's my ruling." Holloway's jaw tightened. Kessler started to object, but the judge waved him silent. "We're done here." Victory. But a temporary one. Nadine left the courthouse at 10:47 a.m., documents in hand, mind racing. The subpoena hearing had been a probe, Holloway testing her defenses, looking for weaknesses. He hadn't found any, but he would keep looking. She was walking toward the parking garage when a hand grabbed her elbow from behind. She spun, muscle memory from years of training, and found herself face to face with Detective Reese Thornton. "Easy." His grip tightened. "Just want a word." "Remove your hand, Detective." "Or what?" He smiled. The smile of a man who had never faced consequences. "You'll record me again? File a complaint? See how far that gets you?" People were walking past. Attorneys, clerks, defendants. None of them stopped. None of them intervened. A cop confronting a black woman outside a courthouse wasn't unusual enough to warrant attention. "You got lucky yesterday." Thornton's voice was low, meant only for her. "The jury believed your little story, but Holloway doesn't forget, and I don't forget. I'll keep that in mind." "You should." He leaned closer. His breath smelled like coffee and something sour. Witnesses who make trouble have a way of getting into trouble. Traffic stops that turn ugly, accusations that stick. Evidence that appears out of nowhere. "Are you threatening me, Detective?" "I'm educating you." His grip shifted, not releasing, but repositioning, preparing for something. Some people need to learn how the world works. Some people need to be taught. She saw it coming. The slight tensing of his arm, the shift in his weight. He was going to shove her, hard enough to send her stumbling, hard enough to make a point. She moved first. Her free hand came up and broke his grip with a technique she had learned at Quantico. Rotate the wrist, push through the weak point, step back. Simple, effective, non-escalatory. Thornton stumbled forward, off balance, surprised by the speed of her response. "Don't touch me again, Detective." His face reddened. His hand moved toward his belt, toward the weapon holstered there. There. You just assaulted a police officer. I defended myself against unwanted physical contact. There's a difference. She held up her phone. The recording light was visible. And it's documented. The moment stretched. Around them, a few people had stopped to watch. Not many, but enough. Witnesses. Potential complications. Thornton's hand moved away from his belt. His expression promised violence, but later. In a place where there were no witnesses, no cameras, no documentation. See you around, Ms. Pryce. He walked away. She watched him go, cataloging every detail, the set of his shoulders, the controlled rage in his stride, the way his hand kept drifting toward his weapon. She had made an enemy. But then, she had come here to make enemies. The afternoon brought unexpected news. Nadine was at a coffee shop near her apartment, public space, multiple exits, easy surveillance detection, when her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her handler. Your anonymous source has been identified. Meet tomorrow, 0600, location attached. Come alone. The attachment was a set of coordinates, a warehouse district on the south side of Atlanta. Industrial, isolated, the kind of place where people could talk without being observed, or where people could disappear without being noticed. She studied the coordinates for a long time, weighed the risks against the potential rewards. An anonymous source who had access to sealed case files and federal encryption protocols. Someone inside the network who wanted it destroyed. The information could be invaluable. The meeting could be a trap. But she had to know. Had to find out who was helping her and why. Had to understand the full scope of what she was fighting. She typed a reply. Confirmed. The warehouse district was dark at 6 a.m. Nadine arrived 15 minutes early, parking 2 blocks away and approaching on foot. She mapped exits, identified cover positions, noted the location of security cameras and potential surveillance points. The meeting location was a loading dock behind an abandoned distribution center. Concrete, chain-link fence, the smell of rust and old oil. She waited. At 6:04 a.m., a car pulled into the lot. Black sedan, tinted windows, government plates. A figure emerged. Female, medium height, professional attire that was out of place in this industrial setting. Nadine's hand moved toward the weapon she had retrieved from her safe deposit box the night before. The Glock sat in a holster under her jacket, loaded, chambered, ready. The figure approached, stopped 10 feet away, let herself be seen. Agent Pryce. The woman's voice was measured, careful. Thank you for coming. Nadine didn't lower her guard. Who are you? Someone who wants the same thing you want. The woman reached into her jacket, slowly, deliberately, making sure the movement couldn't be misinterpreted. She pulled out a small envelope. I've been watching you for 6 months. Watching the case you're building. I think I can help. Why? Because Garrett Holloway destroyed my family. The woman's voice cracked, just slightly before she regained control. 3 years ago, he prosecuted my brother for a crime he didn't commit. Manufactured evidence, altered transcripts, the same playbook he's used 43 times. Your brother's case isn't in my files. It wouldn't be. He died in prison before the appeal could be heard. Stabbing in the yard, officially classified as gang violence. The woman's eyes were hard. There was no gang involvement. My brother was a high school teacher. He'd never been in trouble in his life. Nadine processed the information, cross-referenced it against what she knew. What's in the envelope? Names, dates, the distribution list for the Witness Management Protocol memo that you've been trying to find. The woman held out the envelope. 14 prosecutors in Georgia, 6 in Alabama, 3 in Tennessee. The network is larger than you know. Nadine took the envelope, didn't open it. Why not go to the FBI yourself? Because I work for the Attorney General's office. The woman smiled, bitter, exhausted, angry. And 3 of the names on that list are my colleagues. Sure. The envelope contained everything the woman had promised, and more. Nadine spent the next 4 hours reviewing the contents. Names, dates, case numbers, a map of corruption that extended far beyond Fulton County, beyond Georgia, into a multi-state network of prosecutors who had been systematically falsifying evidence for over a decade. 23 prosecutors, 14 jurisdictions, an estimated 300 affected defendants. The scope was staggering. She uploaded the documents to her secure server, sent an encrypted summary to her handler, began the process of cross-referencing the new information against her existing evidence package. At 11:42 a.m., her handler called back. "We're accelerating. DOJ wants to move on the Georgia targets within 2 weeks. What about the other states? Separate investigations, separate timelines. Your job is Holloway and his network. Can you close the case?" Nadine looked at the files spread across her desk. 18 months of work, 43 documented cases in Fulton County alone. And now, evidence of a conspiracy that extended across state lines. "I can close it." "Good. Be ready. Things are going to move fast." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Nadine coordinated with her handler, with DOJ attorneys, with the FBI's Digital Forensics Lab. Evidence packages were compiled. Arrest warrants were drafted. The machinery of federal justice began to move. She returned to the courthouse each day, maintaining her cover, watching as Holloway and his network continued their operations. They didn't know what was coming. They thought they had neutralized her, one troublesome witness who had been lucky enough to help a defendant escape conviction. They had no idea. On the 4th day, something changed. She was leaving the courthouse at 4:37 p.m. when a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The rear window rolled down. Inside was a man she recognized from photographs in her case files. Chief William Drummond, head of the Fulton County Sheriff's Department, a man whose signature appeared on dozens of suspicious evidence logs. A man who had been on her list of targets for 9 months. "Ms. Pryce?" His voice was calm, conversational. "Get in the car." "I don't think so." That wasn't a request. The front doors opened. 2 men in plain clothes stepped out. Not Thornton, but the same breed, large, intimidating, the kind of men who made problems disappear. "You're going to abduct a citizen in broad daylight, in front of the courthouse?" "We're going to have a conversation." Drummond's smile didn't reach his eyes. "One that determines what happens to you next." Nadine calculated her options. The street was busy, witnesses everywhere. But the men were already moving, positioning themselves to cut off her escape routes. And Drummond wasn't bluffing. He had the power to make her disappear, to fabricate charges that would stick, to bury her in a system he controlled. Unless... "Chief Drummond," she kept her voice steady, "before you do something you can't take back, you should know that I'm not who you think I am." "Is that right?" "My real name isn't in your files. My real employer isn't Mitchell & Associates." She took a deep breath. "And if anything happens to me in the next 30 seconds, 24 federal agents are going to know exactly where I am and who I was with." Drummond's expression flickered. Uncertainty. Fear. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching you for 18 months. She smiled. "And you're about to find out." The SUV's rear window rolled up. The men hesitated, looked at each other, at their boss, at her. "Get back in the car." The men retreated. Doors closed. The SUV pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic. Nadine stood alone on the sidewalk, heart pounding, hands steady. She had just shown part of her hand, revealed too much. The network would be on high alert now, suspicious, paranoid, dangerous. But she had also sent a message. They weren't hunting her anymore. She was hunting them. The acceleration happened faster than anyone expected. 2 days later, Nadine was sitting in a secure briefing room at the FBI's Atlanta field office when the order came down. "We move tomorrow, 0600. Simultaneous raids on 5 locations. Arrest warrants for Holloway, Thornton, Langford, Kessler, and Drummond. You're the lead witness." She had prepared for this moment for 18 months, had documented every crime, every violation, every lie, had built a case that was bulletproof, or as close to bulletproof as any case could be. But she felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the cold clarity of work that still needed to be done. What's the timeline? Arrests tomorrow. Arraignments within 48 hours. Grand jury presentation next week. The supervising agent leaned forward. "This is going to be the biggest public corruption case in Georgia in 20 years. You ready?" Nadine thought about the 43 case files, the 159 years of stolen freedom, the faces of defendants who had been destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them. She thought about the woman in the warehouse, the one whose brother had died in prison for a crime he didn't commit, the one who had risked everything to help expose the truth. She thought about Robert Kwame, home with his family tonight, because she had been there to document the evidence. "I'm ready." The morning of the raids began at 5:42 a.m. Nadine was in the Tactical Command Center, watching feeds from body cameras as federal agents moved into position. 5 teams, 5 locations, coordinated to prevent anyone from alerting others. At 6 a.m. exactly, the operation began. FBI, search warrant. Doors were breached. Suspects were detained. Evidence was secured. She watched as Garrett Holloway was pulled from his bed in a $1 million mansion, confused, angry, shouting about his rights while agents read him Miranda warnings. She watched as Reese Thornton tried to resist and was subdued, not gently, by agents who had been waiting a long time for this moment. She watched as the network she had been hunting for 18 months was systematically dismantled. By 8:15 a.m., all 5 primary targets were in custody. By 9:30 a.m., the press had the story. By noon, the Attorney General of the United States was holding a press conference announcing the largest public corruption prosecution in Georgia history. And Nadine Pryce, Special Agent, FBI Public Corruption Unit, was preparing for the next phase. The arrest was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. The courthouse felt different now. 2 days after the raids, Nadine walked through the same security checkpoint she had passed through as a civilian witness. But this time, she wore her credentials openly. This time, the guards stepped aside with nods of recognition and respect. The case had exploded across national media. Prosecutor arrested in massive corruption scheme. FBI exposes years of falsified evidence. 43. Wrongful convictions under review. The story was everywhere. The implications were staggering. And at the center of it all was the woman who had spent 18 months pretending to be a bookkeeper while she built a case that would destroy a network of corrupt officials. She was heading toward the federal courtroom when she saw him. Gerald Kessler, out on bail waiting for his own arraignment, stood in the hallway with his attorney. His face was gray, his hands trembled. The arrogant fixer who had terrorized witnesses for years looked like a man who had seen his own death approaching. Their eyes met. Kessler said nothing, did nothing, just stood there, frozen, as Nadine walked past. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't gloat, didn't feel anything except the cold determination that had sustained her through 18 months of deception and danger. The work wasn't done. The trials would take months, maybe years. Appeals would be filed, motions would be argued. Some defendants would plea bargain. Some would fight to the end. But the foundation was laid. The evidence was overwhelming. And for the first time in decades, the people who had corrupted this system would face consequences. The preliminary hearing began at 10 a.m. Federal courtroom. Judge Helen Marchand presiding. The defendants, Holloway, Thornton, Langford, Kessler, Drummond, sat at the defense table with their attorneys. The gallery was packed with reporters, family members, curious observers. And in the witness box sat Nadine Pryce. Please state your name and occupation for the record. Nadine Pryce, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit. Holloway's face tightened. Even now, even after everything, she could see him processing, recalculating, trying to figure out how he had missed it. Agent Pryce, please describe the scope of your investigation. Beginning in January 2023, I was assigned to investigate allegations of civil rights violations within the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. She spoke for 47 minutes, documented the evidence, explained the methodology, described the pattern of corruption she had uncovered. 43 cases, 159 years, 23 prosecutors across 3 states. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Marchand looked at the defendants, at their attorneys, at the mountain of evidence that had been presented. Counsel, do you have any questions for this witness? Holloway's attorney stood, opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. No, Your Honor, no questions. Check. The hearing concluded at 12:37 p.m. Bail was continued for some defendants, revoked for others. Trial dates were set. Discovery motions were filed. The machinery of federal justice began its slow, grinding work. Nadine left the courthouse through the main entrance, walking past the cameras and reporters who shouted questions she didn't answer. Her handler fell into step beside her as they approached a waiting vehicle. Good work in there. Thanks. You know, this is just the beginning. The trials will take years. I know. And even when they're done, the system won't be fixed. There are more Holloways out there, more networks, more corruption. Nadine stopped walking, looked back at the courthouse, the columns, the seal, the promise of justice that had been betrayed by the people sworn to uphold it. Then we keep working. Her handler nodded, said nothing else. They got in the car and drove away. The story wasn't over. In the weeks that followed, 8 wrongful conviction reviews were initiated. 2 defendants were released immediately, men who had spent a combined 11 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. 6 more reviews were pending. The consent decree negotiations continued. The independent monitor was appointed. The reforms that had been promised were slowly, painfully being implemented. And somewhere in the system, in other counties, other states, other courthouses, the corruption continued. The networks adapted. The machine found new ways to protect itself. But something had changed. People had seen that it was possible, that one person with enough determination and enough evidence could bring down a system that seemed untouchable. That justice, real justice, was worth fighting for. Nadine knew the fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But she had won this battle, and that meant something. 3 months later, she received a letter. It was hand-delivered to the FBI field office, unusual since most correspondence came through official channels. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. You only saw one piece. There are 47 other jurisdictions in Georgia, and that's just Georgia. Sleep well. She read it twice, then 3 times. The warning was clear. The threat was implicit. Somewhere out there, the larger network was still operating, still corrupting, still destroying lives. She photographed the letter, uploaded it to her secure server, added it to a new case file, one that would take years to build, years to investigate, years to prosecute. The work wasn't done. It was never done. But she was still here, still fighting, still documenting every crime, every violation, every lie. And someday, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but someday, she would burn it all down. Chuck. The letter sat on her desk for 3 days. Nadine had photographed it, cataloged it, uploaded it to secure servers. She had analyzed the paper stock, the font, the postmark. She had run every test available through FBI forensics. Nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no traceable origin. Whoever had sent it understood exactly how to avoid detection. You only saw one piece. There are 47 other jurisdictions in Georgia, and that's just Georgia. The words haunted her. 47 jurisdictions meant 47 potential networks, 47 systems that had been corrupted from the inside, 47 prosecutors, maybe more, who had learned the same playbook that Garrett Holloway had used to destroy lives. She was reviewing case files at 11:43 p.m. when her secure phone buzzed. "We have a problem." Her handler's voice was tight, controlled, the voice of someone delivering bad news they had hoped to avoid. "What kind of problem?" Holloway's defense team filed a motion this afternoon. They're claiming the entire investigation was fruit of the poisonous tree, unauthorized surveillance, entrapment, constitutional violations across the board. Nadine's stomach tightened. On what grounds? They're saying your undercover operation violated his Sixth Amendment rights, that by posing as a witness in an active case, you compromised his ability to conduct a fair prosecution. That's ridiculous. I wasn't investigating the Kwame case. I was investigating him. I know, but they've got a judge who's willing to hear arguments. Motion hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply. This was always the risk with complex investigations, that some procedural technicality would give the defense an opening, that months or years of work would be thrown out because a judge decided the government had crossed an invisible line. Who's the judge? That's the other problem. Her handler paused. Warren Claiborne. The name landed like a punch to the chest. Judge Warren Claiborne. The same judge who had presided over the Kwame trial. The same judge who had watched Holloway bully witnesses without intervention. The same judge whose name appeared in 14 of the 43 case files Nadine had compiled, not as a defendant, but as a silent enabler. He wasn't corrupt in the same way Holloway was corrupt. He hadn't falsified evidence or coordinated witness intimidation, but he had looked the other way, had allowed the system to operate unchecked, had signed warrants and approved motions and rubber-stamped decisions that had sent innocent people to prison, and now he would decide whether the case against Holloway could proceed. Can we challenge his assignment? We're working on it, but it's going to be an uphill battle. He hasn't been formally implicated. As far as the court system is concerned, he's a neutral arbiter. He's not neutral. I know what he is. Her handler's voice hardened. But knowing and proving are different things. Right now we focus on the motion. We prepare the best possible response, and we hope that Claiborne decides his career is worth more than protecting Holloway. Nadine stared at the letter on her desk. The anonymous warning. The 47 jurisdictions. Someone out there was watching. Someone who knew exactly how to apply pressure at exactly the right moment. This isn't a coincidence, she said. The motion, the judge assignment, someone is coordinating this. Probably, but we can't prove that either. Her handler sighed. Get some sleep, Agent Pryce. We've got a long week ahead. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The week before the motion hearing was a blur of preparation. Nadine worked 18-hour days, reviewing every document, every recording, every piece of evidence that had been collected over 18 months. The defense would attack her methodology, her cover identity, her testimony in the Kwame case. Every decision she had made would be scrutinized, questioned, challenged. The DOJ team assembled a response that ran to 237 pages. They cited precedent. They documented authorization. They showed, step by step, how every action Nadine had taken fell within the bounds of federal investigative authority. But they all knew the truth. In a courtroom, precedent could be interpreted. Authorization could be questioned. And a judge who wanted to find a reason to dismiss the case could always find one. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray. Nadine sat in the federal courthouse at 8:47 a.m., watching attorneys file into the building. The motion hearing was scheduled for 9:30. In less than an hour, Judge Claiborne would hear arguments that could destroy everything she had built. Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Claiborne received a visitor last night, late, private residence, black SUV, government plates. She stared at the message. Someone was feeding her information. Someone who had access to surveillance she didn't know existed. The same person who had sent the anonymous letter? Or someone new? She forwarded the message to her handler. Received an immediate response. "We're aware. Working on identification. Stay focused." Stay focused. As if she could think about anything else. The hearing began at 9:32 a.m. Judge Claiborne took the bench with the deliberate slowness of a man who knew everyone in the room was watching. His expression revealed nothing. His eyes swept across the prosecution table, the defense table, the gallery packed with reporters and observers. "We're here on the defense motion to suppress evidence in United States versus Holloway et al." His voice was flat, mechanical. "Counsel for the defense, you may proceed." Marcus Webb, Holloway's lead attorney, brought in from Washington specifically for this case, rose from his chair. Expensive suit, silver hair, the gravitas of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court and won. "Your Honor, the government's case is built on a foundation of constitutional violations. Agent Pryce embedded herself in an active criminal prosecution under false pretenses. She testified as a civilian witness while secretly conducting surveillance on the prosecutor handling the case. This fundamentally compromised Mr. Holloway's ability to conduct a fair trial." He spoke for 23 minutes. Cited case law, referenced constitutional principles, built an argument that was legally sophisticated and factually misleading. The DOJ attorney, Patricia Okonkwo, a veteran prosecutor who had won 3 major corruption cases in the past 5 years, responded with equal force. "Your Honor, Agent Pryce's investigation was authorized by the Department of Justice under 28 U.S.C. Section 533, which grants the FBI authority to investigate federal crimes, including civil rights violations. Her presence in the Kwame trial was incidental to her investigation of Mr. Holloway. She testified truthfully about financial evidence. At no point did she compromise the prosecution's case. Indeed, her testimony helped expose the truth about a defendant who was being wrongfully prosecuted." The arguments went back and forth for 2 hours. Nadine sat in the gallery, watching, listening, waiting. At 11:47 a.m., Judge Claiborne called a recess. "I'll deliver my ruling at 2 p.m. Cool. The recess hours stretched like years. Nadine walked through the courthouse, trying to burn off nervous energy. She passed familiar faces, attorneys she had watched during her undercover operation, clerks who had once looked at her with suspicion, security guards who now nodded with recognition. At 12:36 p.m., she found herself in the courthouse cafeteria. The same cafeteria where she had watched Holloway hold court with his inner circle. The same corner table where Thornton had made racist jokes about witnesses. The table was empty now. Thornton was in federal custody, denied bail after prosecutors presented evidence that he had threatened witnesses. Langford had been fired from her position, her access to courthouse systems revoked. The network that had operated so openly was scattered, broken, fearful, but not defeated. She bought a cup of coffee she didn't want, sat at a table near the windows, tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. "Agent Pryce." The voice came from behind her. Female. Familiar. She turned. Victoria Langford stood 3 feet away, thinner than before, face drawn with stress, eyes that had lost their predatory confidence. "Miss Langford, you shouldn't be talking to me." "I know." Langford glanced around the cafeteria, checking for observers. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not interested in... Claiborne is going to rule in your favor." Nadine froze, studied Langford's face for signs of deception. Found none. "How do you know that?" "Because someone made him an offer he couldn't refuse." Langford's voice was barely above a whisper. "Full immunity from any future prosecution, in exchange for letting the case proceed." "Who made the offer?" "I don't know. But whoever they are, they're bigger than Holloway. Bigger than anyone in this building." Langford leaned closer. "They're cleaning house, Agent Pryce, getting rid of people who've become liabilities. Holloway, Thornton, me, We're all being sacrificed to protect something larger. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm not going to prison for people who threw me away like garbage. Langford's eyes hardened. And because when you find out who's really behind this, I want you to remember that I helped you. She walked away before Nadine could respond. Disappeared through a side exit. Gone. Nadine sat alone in the cafeteria, processing what she had just heard. Someone bigger than Holloway. Someone who could offer immunity deals to sitting judges. Someone who was willing to sacrifice an entire network to protect themselves. The letter. The 47 jurisdictions. The visitor to Claiborne's residence. It was all connected. And she was only beginning to understand how deep it went. Chopped. The ruling came at 2:17 p.m. Judge Claiborne read from prepared remarks, his voice betraying nothing. Legal citations, procedural analysis, the careful language of a judge building a record that could withstand appeal. The court finds that Agent Pryce's investigation was properly authorized under federal law. Her presence in the Kwame trial, while unconventional, did not violate the defendant's constitutional rights. The motion to suppress is denied. The defense table erupted in whispered objections. Holloway's face went pale, then red, then settled into an expression of controlled fury. Additionally, Claiborne continued, the court notes that certain allegations raised by the defense regarding Agent Pryce's conduct are not supported by the evidence presented. Any future motions along these lines should be accompanied by substantive documentation. It was a warning, a shot across the bow of Holloway's defense team. But it was also something else. Claiborne was distancing himself, protecting his own position, making clear that he would not be the one to fall on his sword for Garrett Holloway. Someone had gotten to him. Someone had made it clear that his best chance of survival was to let the case proceed. The hearing adjourned at 2:23 p.m. Nadine left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. She had won this battle. The case would move forward. Holloway would face trial. But the victory felt hollow, because somewhere out there, the real enemy was still operating, still protected, still watching, and she had no idea who they were. The trial began 6 weeks later. Federal courthouse, Judge Helen Marchand presiding, a different venue, a different judge, specifically chosen to eliminate any appearance of bias. The prosecution had requested the change. The defense had objected. The chief judge of the Northern District had granted the request over Holloway's attorneys' protests. Day 1 was jury selection. 14 hours of questioning, challenges, negotiations. By 8:47 p.m., 12 jurors and 4 alternates had been seated. Day 2 was opening statements. Patricia Okonkwo stood before the jury and told them a story about a prosecutor who had sworn to uphold justice and instead had corrupted it. About 43 people whose lives had been destroyed by falsified evidence. About a system that had been weaponized against the citizens it was supposed to protect. The evidence will show that Garrett Holloway didn't just bend the rules. He broke them, systematically, deliberately, for over a decade. And in doing so, he stole 159 years of freedom from people who had committed no crimes. Marcus Webb's opening was equally powerful, but in a different direction. My client has served this community for 22 years. He has prosecuted murderers, rapists, drug dealers. He has kept the streets safe. And now, based on the testimony of a federal agent who deceived everyone in this courtroom, the government wants you to believe he's a criminal. Don't be fooled. This case is about federal overreach, about an FBI agent who manufactured evidence to advance her own career, about a witch hunt that has already destroyed innocent lives. The battle lines were drawn. The war had begun. Basso. Make sure you're subscribed. The testimony you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about this case. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. Nadine testified for 4 days. She walked the jury through 18 months of investigation. She explained the pattern she had discovered, the falsified transcripts, the disappeared evidence, the coordinated witness intimidation. She presented documents, recordings, forensic analyses. Webb's cross-examination was brutal. Agent Pryce, isn't it true that you deceived the court by testifying in the Kwame trial under false pretenses? I testified truthfully about the financial evidence I had analyzed, but you concealed your true identity. My identity wasn't relevant to the testimony I provided. So you believe it's acceptable for federal agents to lie to courts? Objection. Okonkwo was on her feet. Argumentative. Sustained. Webb tried again, and again. He attacked her credibility, her methodology, her motives. He suggested she had fabricated evidence. He implied she had a personal vendetta against Holloway. She answered every question with the same calm precision she had displayed in the Kwame trial, the same unshakable composure that had first made Holloway suspicious. On the fourth day of her testimony, Webb made a mistake. Agent Pryce, you claim to have found evidence of 43 falsified transcripts. But isn't it possible that these so-called alterations were simply clerical errors? No. No? You're certain? The alterations followed a consistent pattern. They always favored the prosecution. They always appeared in cases involving minority defendants. And they were always traced to the same court reporter terminal, Terminal 7, assigned to Meredith Vance. Ms. Vance is not on trial here. No, she's cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. Nadine paused. Let the jury absorb the implication. She's already provided testimony about who instructed her to make those alterations. Webb's expression flickered. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't been told about Vance's cooperation. Move to strike. The witness is testifying about matters not in evidence. Your Honor, Ms. Vance's testimony is scheduled for tomorrow. Agent Pryce is simply explaining why she's confident the alterations were deliberate. I'll allow it. The jury will consider this testimony in context of evidence yet to be presented. Webb retreated. The damage was done. Meredith Vance testified for 2 days. She was a different woman from the one Nadine had confronted in the courthouse bathroom. Smaller, somehow. Diminished. The confidence that had allowed her to offer transcript alterations like party favors had been replaced by the hollow-eyed fear of someone facing prison time. Ms. Vance, who instructed you to alter court transcripts? Mr. Holloway. Garrett Holloway. How did he communicate these instructions? Sometimes in person, sometimes through Ms. Langford. Sometimes he would just mark up a copy of the transcript and leave it on my desk with a sticky note that said, "Fix this." And you complied with these instructions? Yes. Her voice broke. I knew it was wrong, but I needed the job. I have 2 kids, medical bills. I couldn't afford to... She stopped, wiped her eyes. I made a choice, a terrible choice, and people went to prison because of it. The jury watched her cry. Some of them looked sympathetic. Others looked disgusted. Webb's cross-examination was careful, too aggressive, and he risked making Vance more sympathetic. Too soft, and her testimony would stand unchallenged. Ms. Vance, isn't it true that you're testifying against Mr. Holloway in exchange for a reduced sentence? Yes. So you have an incentive to say whatever the prosecution wants you to say. I'm telling the truth. Are you? Or are you telling the story that gets you the best deal? Objection. Argumentative. Withdrawn. Webb turned to the jury. No further questions. But the damage was done. Vance had confirmed the pattern. Vance had put Holloway's name on the conspiracy, and while the defense could attack her credibility, they couldn't erase what the jury had heard. The prosecution called 37 witnesses over 3 weeks. FBI analysts who had reconstructed deleted evidence. Digital forensics experts who had traced the transcript alterations to specific user accounts. Victims of wrongful prosecution who testified about the lives they had lost. Jobs, families, years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. Marcus Williams took the stand on day 14. He had spent 7 years in prison for armed robbery, a crime he hadn't committed. The transcript from his trial showed him confessing to details he had never said. The original court recording, recovered from backup servers by FBI technicians, proved the confession had been fabricated. Mr. Williams, can you describe what happened when you first saw the original recording? I couldn't believe it. His voice was quiet, haunted. For 7 years, I thought I was crazy. I knew I didn't say those things, but the transcript said I did. My lawyer said I did. The judge said I did. I started to think maybe I was losing my mind. And when you heard the original recording, I heard the truth. I heard myself say I was innocent, over and over, and I heard that woman, the court reporter, typing something different. He paused, looked directly at Holloway. You stole 7 years of my life. You took me away from my children. You made me believe I was insane. For what? So you could put another win on your record? Holloway's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Fear. The defense case began on day 18. Webb called character witnesses, colleagues who praised Holloway's dedication, community leaders who spoke of his public service, law enforcement officials who credited him with keeping the streets safe. He called expert witnesses who challenged the FBI's forensic methodology, who suggested the transcript alterations could have been software glitches, who raised questions about chain of custody and evidence handling. He called Holloway himself. It was a risky move. Putting a defendant on the stand opened them to cross-examination. But Webb had decided that Holloway's charm, the same charm that had convinced juries to convict innocent people for 2 decades, was his best weapon. Mr. Holloway, did you ever instruct anyone to alter court transcripts? Absolutely not. Did you ever coordinate with Detective Thornton to intimidate witnesses? Never. Detective Thornton and I had a professional relationship. Nothing more. What about the allegations that you falsified evidence? They're lies. Fabrications by a federal agent who targeted me because I was effective at my job. Holloway leaned forward, addressed the jury directly. For 22 years I have served this community. I have put dangerous criminals behind bars. I have made this city safer. And now, because I did my job too well, because I made enemies among people who didn't like being prosecuted, I'm being accused of crimes I didn't commit. He was good. Nadine had to admit that. His voice carried conviction. His eyes projected sincerity. If she didn't know what she knew, if she hadn't spent 18 months documenting his crimes, she might have believed him. But she did know, and the cross-examination was coming. Patricia Okonkwo approached the witness stand with a folder in her hand. Mr. Holloway, you testified that you never instructed anyone to alter transcripts. Is that correct? Correct. And you testified that you never coordinated with Detective Thornton to intimidate witnesses. That's right. Then can you explain this? She activated the courtroom's display system. A video appeared, body cam footage, timestamp visible in the corner. The image showed a parking garage, 2 figures talking. The audio was clear. The witness is a problem. Handle it. How permanent? Use your judgment. The courtroom was silent. On the screen, Holloway's face was clearly visible. His voice was unmistakable. Mr. Holloway, that's you in the video, isn't it? The audio could have been manipulated. The FBI's digital forensics lab has authenticated this recording. 3 independent experts have confirmed it hasn't been altered. Okonkwo's voice hardened. That's you telling Detective Thornton to handle a witness, isn't it? I was speaking generally, about case management. It wasn't, how permanent. Those were Detective Thornton's words. What did you think he was asking about, Mr. Holloway? Objection. Webb was on his feet. Counsel is badgering the witness. Overruled. The witness will answer. Holloway's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for the jury to see. I don't recall the specific context of that conversation. You don't recall telling a detective to handle a witness? You don't recall him asking, how permanent? You don't recall any of it? I'm saying the words have been taken out of context. Then let me provide context. Okonkwo pulled another document from her folder. This is the incident report filed by Detective Thornton 3 days after this conversation. It documents a welfare check on witness Angela Foster. During that welfare check, Ms. Foster allegedly fell down a flight of stairs. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital with a broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, and a severe concussion. She never testified at trial. The defendant in that case was convicted and sentenced to 15 years. I had nothing to do with... Ms. Foster is in this courtroom today, Mr. Holloway. Would you like to explain to her what handle it meant? Objection. Withdrawn. Okonkwo turned to the jury. No further questions. The defense rested on day 22. Closing arguments took 2 days. Okonkwo summarized the evidence, the recordings, the transcripts, the testimony of victims and cooperating witnesses. Webb argued reasonable doubt, federal overreach, the dangers of convicting a man based on the word of criminals and compromised witnesses. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On day 26, they returned. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with glasses and a serious expression, stood with the verdict form in her hands. In the matter of United States v. Garrett Holloway, on count 1, conspiracy to violate civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Sedeker 241, how does the jury find? Guilty. On count 2 through 17, deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Bar 2 at 42, how does the jury find? Guilty on all counts. On count 18 through 23, obstruction of justice under 18 U.S.C. 11512, how does the jury find? Guilty on all counts. The verdicts continued. 25 counts. 25 guilty verdicts. Holloway sat motionless at the defense table, face gray, hands trembling. The man who had destroyed 43 lives, who had stolen 159 years of freedom, had finally been held accountable. Sentencing was scheduled for 60 days later. The other trials moved more quickly. Detective Reese Thornton pleaded guilty to civil rights violations and witness tampering in exchange for a 20-year sentence. He would be eligible for parole in 12 years. Victoria Langford accepted a plea deal, 5 years for conspiracy and obstruction. Her cooperation had helped secure convictions against 3 other members of the network. Gerald Kessler fought his case to the end. He was convicted on 7 counts and sentenced to 15 years. Chief William Drummond was the wild card. His trial was scheduled separately, and his defense team had assembled an army of character witnesses and expert consultants. The outcome was uncertain. But the core of the network had been dismantled. The main players were facing prison time. The system that had operated with impunity for over a decade had been exposed. Partial justice, but justice nonetheless. Holloway's sentencing hearing took place on a Tuesday in March. The courtroom was packed. Victims of his prosecutions filled the gallery, some free, others still fighting for exoneration. Families of people who had died in prison. Journalists documenting the final chapter of a story that had captivated the nation. Judge Marchand invited victim impact statements before pronouncing sentence. Marcus Williams spoke first. 7 years stolen. Children who had grown up without a father. A marriage that had collapsed under the strain. He spoke quietly, without anger, which somehow made his words more devastating. Angela Foster spoke next, the woman who had been pushed down a flight of stairs during a welfare check. Her arm still didn't work right. She still had nightmares. She still flinched when she saw police officers on the street. 12 victims spoke in total. 12 stories of lives destroyed, families shattered, years that could never be recovered. When they finished, Judge Marchand turned to Holloway. The defendant may address the court. Holloway stood. He was thinner than he had been at the start of the trial. The arrogance that had defined him for 22 years had been replaced by something else, not remorse exactly, but the awareness of someone who finally understood that the rules applied to him, too. Your Honor, I have served this community for over 2 decades. I believed in what I was doing. I believed I was making the city safer. He paused, swallowed. I made mistakes. I take responsibility for those mistakes. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was the carefully calibrated statement of a man still hoping for leniency. Judge Marchand was not impressed. Mr. Holloway, you have been convicted of 25 felony counts, including civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The evidence presented at trial demonstrated a pattern of conduct spanning over a decade: systematic falsification of evidence, coordination of witness intimidation, and deliberate destruction of innocent lives. You have shown no genuine remorse for your actions. You have accepted no meaningful responsibility. You have, instead, portrayed yourself as a victim of federal overreach, while actual victims of your crimes sat in this courtroom and told us what you took from them. She paused. Let the silence stretch. The court sentences you to 42 years in federal prison. You will be eligible for parole after serving 35 years. Given your age, this is effectively a life sentence. And in my judgment, it is the minimum consequence adequate for the harm you have caused. Holloway swayed. For a moment, it seemed like he might collapse. Then his attorney steadied him, guided him back to his seat. 42 years. It wasn't enough. No sentence could restore what had been stolen. But it was something. A marker. A statement that the system, when pushed hard enough, when forced to confront its own corruption, could still deliver something resembling justice. Don't go anywhere. What happens next will show you why this fight is far from over. The weeks after sentencing brought a cascade of developments. Wrongful conviction reviews accelerated. 23 cases were reopened. 8 defendants were released immediately, men and women who had spent a combined 41 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. 9 more cases were pending further review. 6 were denied, not because the defendants were guilty, but because procedural barriers made it impossible to overturn their convictions despite the evidence of misconduct. The system protected itself, even in defeat, even when the corruption had been exposed. Nadine attended 3 of the release hearings, watched as men walked out of federal facilities into the arms of families who had waited years for this moment, watched as they blinked in sunlight they hadn't seen except through barred windows, watched as they tried to process the reality that their nightmare was finally over. Marcus Williams was released on a Thursday afternoon. His mother was there. His ex-wife, remarried now but still caring enough to come. His children, teenagers who had been elementary schoolers when he went away, stood awkwardly to the side, not sure how to greet a father they barely remembered. Agent Pryce. She turned. Williams stood behind her, still wearing the clothes he had been arrested in 7 years ago, somehow preserved by a system that had stolen everything else from him. Mr. Williams. Thank you. His voice was thick. I know you were doing your job, but you gave me my life back. I don't know how to... You don't owe me anything. She meant it. What happened to you should never have happened. I'm sorry it took so long to fix. 7 years. He shook his head. My kids don't know me. My marriage is gone. I missed everything. He looked toward his family, waiting by a car in the parking lot. But I'm alive. And I'm free. And the man who did this to me is going to die in prison. Yes, he is. Williams nodded, extended his hand. She shook it. Good luck, Agent Pryce. I hope you get the rest of them. He walked toward his family. She watched him go. The rest of them. The letter, the 47 jurisdictions, the network that extended far beyond Fulton County. She had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The investigation expanded in April. Based on the evidence Nadine had compiled and the documents provided by her anonymous source, the Department of Justice opened parallel investigations in 14 Georgia counties. Additional inquiries were launched in Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina. The pattern was everywhere: falsified transcripts, disappeared evidence, coordinated witness intimidation, prosecutors who had learned the same playbook from the same sources, or who had invented it independently because corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. Nadine was assigned to coordinate intelligence sharing between the various investigative teams. It meant long hours, endless documentation, the tedious work of building cases that might take years to reach trial. But it also meant access to information, to patterns, to the larger picture that was slowly coming into focus. The network wasn't random. It wasn't a collection of individual bad actors who happened to use similar methods. It was organized, coordinated. Someone was teaching these techniques. Someone was protecting these prosecutors. Someone was profiting from a system that sent innocent people to prison. She just had to figure out who. Mate. The answer came from an unexpected source. It was May, 3 months after Holloway's sentencing, when Victoria Langford reached out again. The message arrived through a secure channel that shouldn't have existed. An encrypted email to an address that was supposedly known only to FBI personnel. I have information, but I need protection first. Real protection, not the kind that disappears when it becomes inconvenient. Nadine forwarded the message to her handler. Within 48 hours, a meeting was arranged. The safe house was in a suburb north of Atlanta, a nondescript ranch home that had been seized in a drug case and repurposed for federal use. Langford arrived in a rental car, looking over her shoulder, moving with the paranoid caution of someone who had spent months expecting violence. "Thank you for coming." "What do you have?" Langford sat down, pulled a thumb drive from her pocket, placed it on the table between them. "Names, dates, financial records, the complete organizational structure of what you're looking for." She paused. "It's called the Foundation. They've been operating for over 30 years. They have people in prosecutors' offices in 23 states. They have judges. They have law enforcement. They have politicians who make sure investigations go nowhere." Nadine stared at the thumb drive. "How do you know all this?" "Because I was recruited 15 years ago. Because I spent a decade helping them place people in courthouses across the Southeast. Because when I stopped being useful, they threw me away like garbage." "Why come forward now?" "Because I'm facing 5 years in federal prison. Because my children won't speak to me. Because I lost everything protecting people who never cared whether I lived or died." Langford's voice cracked. "And because I want them to burn." The thumb drive contained everything Langford had promised, and more. 237 names. Prosecutors, judges, law enforcement officials, political operatives. Financial records showing payments funneled through shell companies. Organizational charts showing chains of command. Meeting notes from conferences where corruption techniques were taught like continuing education courses. The Foundation had been operating since 1992. It had started as an informal network of prosecutors who shared strategies for winning difficult cases. Over time, it had evolved into something darker. A machine for manufacturing convictions, for weaponizing the justice system against vulnerable populations, for generating the statistics that ambitious politicians used to claim they were tough on crime. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested over 2,000 wrongful convictions across 23 states, thousands more cases where sentences had been enhanced based on falsified evidence, lives destroyed, families shattered, communities devastated. And at the top of the organizational chart, the person who had founded the network, who had recruited and trained and protected its members for 30 years, was a name Nadine recognized: Chief Justice Eleanor Vance of the Georgia Supreme Court. The revelation changed everything. A sitting state Supreme Court justice, one of the most respected legal figures in the Southeast, a woman who had been mentioned as a potential nominee to the federal bench. She was the architect of a corruption network that spanned 2 decades and 23 states. How do we proceed? Nadine was in the FBI field office, surrounded by supervisors and DOJ attorneys and representatives from the Inspector General's office. Everyone understood the implications. Everyone knew this case could reshape American jurisprudence or destroy careers if it went wrong. Carefully. The supervising agent was a man named Douglas Chen, 30 years with the Bureau, veteran of cases that had brought down governors and senators and business executives. He had never seen anything like this. We verify everything. We build redundant evidence chains. We make sure that when we move, there's no possibility of escape. And in the meantime? In the meantime, the foundation keeps operating. More people get convicted. More lives get destroyed. Chen's expression was grim. That's the cost of doing this right. How long? Minimum 6 months. Probably longer. 6 months. In that time, how many innocent people would be sent to prison? How many families would be torn apart? How many lives would be stolen by a system that was supposed to protect them? But Chen was right. Moving too fast meant risking everything. One procedural error, one piece of evidence that couldn't be authenticated, one witness whose credibility could be challenged, and the entire case could collapse. Justice was slow. Maddeningly, agonizingly slow. But it was still justice. The investigation proceeded through summer and fall. Nadine worked 16-hour days, coordinating teams across 7 states. She reviewed financial records, interviewed witnesses, built timelines that connected decades of corruption to specific individuals and specific decisions. The picture that emerged was worse than anyone had imagined. The foundation didn't just falsify evidence, it identified vulnerable defendants, people without resources, without connections, without the ability to fight back, and targeted them specifically. It trained prosecutors in techniques for manipulating juries, for intimidating witnesses, for exploiting procedural loopholes. It created a factory for injustice, operating in plain sight, protected by the very institutions that were supposed to prevent such abuses. In October, the first arrests were made. 17 prosecutors across 4 states, coordinated raids, pre-dawn warrants. The same playbook that had brought down Holloway, scaled up and replicated. The press coverage was overwhelming. Massive corruption network exposed. FBI arrests prosecutors in 4 states. Supreme Court justice under investigation. Chief Justice Eleanor Vance was not arrested, not yet. The evidence against her was strong, but the political complications were enormous. Arresting a sitting state Supreme Court justice required sign-off from the Attorney General himself, required certainty that the case would hold up under the most intense scrutiny imaginable. But the noose was tightening. Her allies were being arrested. Her network was being dismantled. Her protection was evaporating. It was only a matter of time. The final act came in December. Nadine was in her office at the FBI field office when the call came. Her handler's voice was tight with controlled excitement. "We got the green light. Arrest warrant for Vance. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. "Are we sure?" AG signed off personally. This is it. 18 months since she had first walked into Fulton County Courthouse posing as a bookkeeper. 18 months of deception, danger, and grinding investigative work. And now, finally, the architect of it all would face justice. I want to be there. That's why I'm calling. You're on the arrest team. December 17th dawned cold and clear. The convoy assembled at 5:15 a.m., 4 FBI vehicles, 2 U.S. Marshal SUVs, support from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, 23 federal agents and officers, armed with warrants and body armor, and the weight of evidence that had taken years to compile. Eleanor Vance lived in a gated community north of Atlanta. Old money, private security, the kind of neighborhood where federal agents showing up at dawn would generate phone calls to lawyers and politicians within minutes. They didn't care. At 5:58 a.m., the convoy approached the gate. The security guard took one look at the FBI credentials and the warrant and opened the barrier without comment. At 6:01 a.m., they reached the Vance residence. Colonial architecture, manicured lawn, American flag hanging from the porch, The irony was not lost on anyone. Nadine was with the team that approached the front door. Her weapon was drawn. Her heart was pounding. This was the moment she had been working toward for almost 2 years. The agent in charge knocked. "FBI, we have a warrant." Silence. Another knock. "FBI, open the door." Movement inside. Footsteps approaching. The door opened. Eleanor Vance stood in the doorway, 72 years old, silver hair, the dignified bearing of a woman who had spent her life commanding respect. She was wearing a bathrobe. Her expression showed no surprise. "Chief Justice Eleanor Vance, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and racketeering." The agent in charge held up the warrant. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Vance listened to the Miranda warning without expression. When it was finished, she extended her hands for the cuffs. "I've been expecting you, Agent Pryce." Nadine froze. Vance was looking directly at her. "You've done impressive work, truly. But you should know, this doesn't end with me. The Foundation has been operating for 30 years. It has roots deeper than you can imagine. You can arrest me, you can convict me, but you won't destroy what I built." "We'll see about that." Vance smiled. The smile of someone who knew things she wasn't sharing, who had contingency plans for contingencies, who had spent 30 years building a machine that could survive the loss of any single component, even its founder. "Yes, we will." She was led to a waiting vehicle. Nadine watched her go, feeling victory and unease in equal measure. They had caught the architect, but the architecture remained, in 23 states, in hundreds of courthouses, in thousands of cases that might never be reviewed. The work wasn't done. It would never be done. The aftermath unfolded over months. Eleanor Vance was held without bail, flight risk, the judge ruled, given her resources and connections. Her trial was scheduled for the following spring. The other Foundation members faced their own proceedings. Some pleaded guilty, some fought. Some cut deals in exchange for information about operations in states that hadn't yet been targeted. The scope of the cleanup was staggering. 23 states, hundreds of prosecutors, judges, and officials who had been compromised. Thousands of cases that needed review. A justice system that had been corrupted at a fundamental level, requiring years, maybe decades, to repair. Nadine was promoted, commended, given leadership of a new task force dedicated to prosecutorial misconduct investigations. She accepted the role knowing it meant a lifetime of work, knowing that every case she closed would reveal 2 more that needed investigation, knowing that the system she was fighting was bigger than any individual or any organization. But she also knew something else. It could be fought. It could be exposed. It could be forced to change, slowly, painfully, one case at a time. That was enough. It had to be enough. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this. And remember, sometimes the biggest reveals are the ones no one sees coming. 3 months after Vance's arrest, Nadine received another letter. Same anonymous sender, same untraceable origin, same typed message on plain white paper. "You did well. The Georgia network is dismantled, but there are others, networks you haven't found yet, networks that learned from the Foundation's mistakes. If you want to find them, start looking at federal appointments. The next generation is already in place." She read the letter 3 times, then photographed it, uploaded it, added it to a file that was growing larger by the day. Federal appointments. The next generation. Somewhere out there, the corruption was evolving, learning, adapting, and she would find it, no matter how long it took. 6 months later, Eleanor Vance went to trial. The proceedings lasted 11 weeks. The prosecution presented evidence of a 30-year conspiracy, documents, recordings, testimony from cooperating witnesses who had been part of the network since its inception. The defense argued that Vance was a dedicated public servant who had been framed by federal agents with political motivations. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They found her guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 months later. Given her age, any substantial prison term would effectively be a life sentence. But there were complications. 2 days after the verdict, Eleanor Vance was found dead in her cell. Official cause? Heart failure. Natural causes. No evidence of foul play. Nadine didn't believe it. Neither did anyone else who understood how the foundation operated. Dead women told no tales. Dead women couldn't cut deals in exchange for information about operations that hadn't yet been exposed. Dead women couldn't testify about networks in states where investigations hadn't even begun. Someone had silenced her, and whoever that someone was, they were still out there, still protected, still operating. The investigation continued. Nadine followed the leads from the anonymous letters, looked into federal appointments, found patterns that suggested the foundation, or something like it, had evolved beyond state-level prosecutors into the federal judiciary itself. The implications were terrifying. If the network had placed people at the federal level, district judges, circuit court judges, maybe higher, then the entire federal justice system could be compromised. Every appeal, every habeas corpus petition, every challenge to wrongful conviction could be blocked by judges who were part of the machine. She documented everything, built new case files, coordinated with investigators in other districts who had noticed similar patterns. The work was slow, tedious, often discouraging. But she kept going. Because somewhere out there, innocent people were being convicted by a system that had been weaponized against them. Because every day that the network operated was another day of stolen freedom. Because justice, real justice, was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed endless. The story ended, but didn't end, on a Tuesday in April. Nadine was in her office reviewing files from an investigation in Tennessee when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, no caller ID. She answered anyway. Agent Pryce? The voice was electronically distorted, impossible to identify. Who is this? A friend, someone who's been watching your work for a long time. What do you want? To give you a gift. A pause. Check your secure email. You'll find a file. Names of 17 federal judges who were appointed through Foundation influence. Evidence of coordination. Enough to start investigations in 9 new districts. Why are you helping me? Because the Foundation isn't the only network. Because there are people inside the system who want to clean it up. Because sometimes the only way to fight corruption is from the inside. Who are you? The voice paused. When it spoke again, there was something different in its tone, something almost human. Someone who made mistakes, who helped build something terrible, who's trying now to tear it down. Another pause. Good luck, Agent Pryce. You're going to need it. The line went dead. Nadine stared at her phone for a long moment. Then she opened her secure email. The file was there. 17 names, supporting documentation, the outline of investigations that would take years to complete. More work, more cases, more battles against a system that didn't want to be fixed. She downloaded the file, added it to her growing collection of evidence, started planning the next steps. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But she was still here, still working, still documenting every crime, every violation, every lie. And someday, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but someday, the system would change. Not because it wanted to, because people like her made it. 1 year later, Nadine stood at a podium in Washington, D.C. The occasion was a press conference announcing the largest federal investigation into judicial corruption in American history. 17 judges, 9 districts. Evidence of a network that had been placing compromised jurists on federal benches for over 2 decades. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Politicians who had spent careers ignoring systemic corruption suddenly discovered a passion for accountability. She answered their questions with the same measured calm she had displayed in courtrooms across the country, provided details that could be shared publicly, declined to comment on ongoing investigations. When the press conference ended, she stepped away from the podium and walked through a crowd of officials and journalists toward the exit. A man fell into step beside her. Tall, professional, the bearing of someone who had spent decades in government service. "Agent Pryce, impressive work. Thank you. The Attorney General wants to speak with you about expanding your task force, giving you resources to pursue investigations at the national level." "I'm listening. He'll be in touch." The man handed her a card. "In the meantime, watch your back. The people you're fighting have resources you can't imagine. They won't stop trying to protect themselves." "Neither will I." The man studied her for a moment. Something like respect flickered across his face. "Good. The system needs more people like you." He walked away. Nadine looked at the card, a direct line to the Attorney General's office, then slipped it into her pocket. More resources, more authority, more ability to pursue the networks that were still operating in shadows across the country. The fight was getting bigger, but so was she. The final scene took place in Atlanta 2 weeks later. Nadine visited the grave of Eleanor Vance. Not to mourn, she felt nothing for the woman who had built a machine for injustice, but to mark the moment, to acknowledge that one chapter had ended, even as another was beginning. The cemetery was quiet. Spring flowers were beginning to bloom. Somewhere in the distance, birds were singing. She stood at the graveside and thought about the 43 cases in Fulton County, the 159 years of stolen freedom, the thousands more victims across 23 states whose cases were still being reviewed. She thought about Marcus Williams, rebuilding a life that had been stolen from him, about Angela Foster, still healing from injuries inflicted by a system that was supposed to protect her, about all the people whose names she didn't know, who had suffered in silence, who had believed they were alone, who had never imagined that someone was fighting for them. She thought about the anonymous letters, the informant who had helped her from the shadows, the suggestion that there were people inside the system who wanted to clean it up, who were willing to risk everything to expose the corruption they had once been part of. Change was possible, slow, painful, incomplete, but possible. That was enough. It had to be enough. She turned away from the grave and walked back toward her car. Her phone buzzed with a new message, another lead, another case, another opportunity to make the system a little less broken. She answered it. The work continued.